Okay. Welcome to our virtual event with author Peter Canellos. He is an award-winning writer and former editorial page editor of the Boston Globe and executive editor of Politico. He is the editor of the New York Times bestseller Last Lion, The Fall and Rise of Ted Kennedy. Peter has long-standing Berkshire ties, having been coming here for 3 decades and owning a home in Great Barrington for 2 decades. He's joining us from Great Barrington this evening. The book he's going to talk to us about tonight was almost entirely written in the Berkshires, and there are intriguing ties to this region. The great Supreme Court Justice that Peter writes about, John Marshall Harlan, is best known for his powerful dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson, decrying the Supreme Court support for segregation. But the justice who wrote the majority opinion in that case, Henry Billings Brown, was born in Lee. Justice Stephen Field, another Harlan antagonist in economic cases, hails from Stockbridge. Unfortunately, most people believe it was Harlan, not the Berkshire-bred justices, who are right on those issues. But it's interesting to note how much U.S. jurisprudence actually hails from our county. So with that, I am very pleased to introduce to you Peter Canellos. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Katie. And again, I'm sorry that we can't do this in person. Would have been fun. The Lenox Library is such a beautiful cultural institution. It's such a great sort of gathering place for our community. So hopefully someday we'll be able to do it again. But I also thank so many people for coming out virtually. I know it's a tough night and all, and I can't see everybody, but I've seen a few familiar names and faces already. So thank you all so much for coming out. Picking up a little bit on what Katie said, I'm going to sort of walk you through why I consider John Marshall Harlan a truly important and seminal figure in our justice system. Perhaps our most important figure in the justice system, certainly since his namesake, John Marshall, the great Chief Justice, who first asserted the right to have the courts rather than politics interpret the Constitution. The Chief Justice, John Marshall, had asserted the primacy of law over politics, which, as you'll see, is very, very important to Harlan and to his upbringing. But I also want to talk a little bit about those Northern justices who served on the Supreme Court at the same time as Harlan and were in some ways his antagonists, many of whom had roots in this area, several from the Berkshires, one of them from Albany. So it was a very interesting time in American history, and it was a time, obviously, when this part of the country played a very significant role in the development of the national ideology. Let's start with John Marshall Harlan and why Harlan interests me and why I think people should care about Harlan. He served on the Supreme Court at a very important time. It was from 1877 to 1911. This was a period when the Constitution had effectively been remade by the Reconstruction era amendments, which were designed to sort of create for the first time a kind of sense of federal citizenship and federal rights that superseded your state rights as citizens, and that restricted ways in which the state could alter your lives. Most of these issues had really not been, or most of the issues before the court had not been considered in light of these new amendments before. So during the time that Harlan was on the court, a lot of the things that came before him were matters of first impression. And what was very significant is that his view of what those Reconstruction amendments meant differed sharply from that of his colleagues. I also think he's important because if we look back at that era, again, from 1877 to 1911, it's been 150 years. We have the benefit of hindsight now. We understand history. We can see what it is from that time that worked out well and what it is that didn't work out well. We can see who we think was right in light of later knowledge and who we think was wrong in light of later knowledge. We also can see what it is that happened during that time that had great resonance later on in our lives and continue to shape our lives today. And the two things that most come out of that is that it was the start of segregation, which has bedeviled the United States ever since, for 100 years of real separation between the races, and now a legacy of that period that continues to affect our lives in the current day. The other big thing that comes out of that era is income inequality. You know, we right here in Lenox and Great Barrington and Stockbridge, you know, we see the great homes that were built, the cottages that were built by people of great wealth, and in other parts of the country, Long Island, Newport, some were even grander. In New York, they were even grander. People were building homes that were modeled on Louis XIV's chateaus. And yet there were other people, immigrant laborers, who were living 5 and 6 to a room. Even though everybody worked, they could only afford that kind of living. So we go back and we think, how can it be that something as pernicious, as evil as segregation could really take root in our society? And how could inequality of such a dramatic scale exist? And the answer is not that there was some bad president during that time. It was not that Congress was totally unresponsive. It was because of the Supreme Court. You know, Congress actually acted, right? In 1875, Congress passed a federal civil rights law that guaranteed Black people full and equal access to accommodations and transportation. But the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. The Supreme Court also declared voting rights unenforceable, even though they were sitting right there in the Constitution. In the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, it endorsed the legal architecture of segregation, the separate but equal. And then you say, well, what about income inequality? Well, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which would deal with the railroad-based monopolies that were setting prices and wages during that period, but it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. They also passed for the first time an income tax, which was seen as a fairer way to fund the federal government, which had been funded by tariffs up to that point, but the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. And then in the case of Lochner v. New York, the Supreme Court declared that efforts by state legislatures, including the one next door to Massachusetts in New York, but Massachusetts also had a similar law, limiting the hours of bakers and limiting the hours of industrial workers generally, that those laws were per se unconstitutional because anything that was done in the name of enforcing workers' rights and protecting labor peace was per se unconstitutional. The common thread in all of those cases that I mentioned is John Marshall Harlan dissented. In most of those cases, he was the sole dissenter. That meant only John Marshall Harlan, of all of the people on the Supreme Court, and frankly, in the race cases of almost anyone in a position of power of authority, was the only person willing to stand up against these terrible trends. So when I first encountered Harlan as a law student in the late 1980s, you know, his dissents kind of leaped off the page. You know, here was a man with a very different sense of justice, completely at odds with everybody, all his contemporaries, all the other justices. And yet, at that time, very comfortably in the mainstream of American life. So a bunch of questions sort of entered my mind. One is, what is it that made this one man see everything in a way that we now believe, as we did in the 1980s, that he was wiser, that he was right and they were wrong? What was the source of his difference? And the question also being, did his dissents play a role in the fact that the law is quite different right now? And I think you'll see that the answers to all those questions are fascinating. And that's the story of this book. I mean, this is what it is. It's an exploration of the roots of wisdom in the law and telling you how one person came to see things differently than all of his colleagues and then was proven right over time, and the role that his dissents played in that process of overturning those terrible precedents on the Supreme Court. Now, let me give you a little bit about John Harlan's life. He was born in Kentucky in 1833. He was born to a prominent family, but one that was only, 2 generations removed from the wilderness, essentially. His father, James Harlan, was sort of the most prominent lawyer in the state. And his great pride was building the best and fullest private law library in the state. However, in 1833, when he was born, Kentucky was in a perilous position and would be so for most of his upbringing. And that is that even at that time, the secession crisis and the dispute, the national dispute over slavery, was raging in this country. He was only 3 years removed from the Missouri Compromise. Henry Clay, who had authored the Missouri Compromise, and who was the architect of all these compromises to try to prevent a civil war, was the dominant figure in Kentucky. He was a close friend of John Harlan's father. And from the earliest age, John Harlan looked up to Clay, would attend Clay's speeches, watch the great man in action. But I think it must have been quite painful for a boy like that, because Henry Clay's belief, his father, James Harlan's belief, was that Kentucky would be destroyed by a civil war. You're seeing this political crisis all around you, leading inexorably towards war, seemingly inexorably towards war. And yet the people in Kentucky felt that because of geography, because they were right in the middle between North and South, and because of their own politics, where they were divided between Northern and Southern sympathies, between slave and free sympathies, that it would destroy the civic fabric. The battles would destroy towns and cities. The civic fabric would be destroyed by politics. So John Harlan, with these two men that he greatly admired, Henry Clay and his own father, fought to create compromise or to find some common ground that would prevent the Civil War. In most cases, this took the form of things like the colonization society, the idea that you could sort of pay masters to free their enslaved people and return them to Africa, and thereby try to preserve some of the existing social order in a way that wouldn't offend people. There was just straight out talk of perhaps compensating some slave owners so that the economic cost of emancipation could be absorbed. There were geographical constraints in many other sets of compromises that were put forward. And John Harlan was an enthusiastic supporter of those compromises. If you ask, well, what was his view of slavery? What was his family's view of slavery? It was fairly critical. There was a belief that there was a real problem there. There was a belief that the country should eventually be all free. But there was also a fear of immediate emancipation because of the very intense belief that it would cause a war that would destroy their lives and destroy their state, especially. This became more and more intense as Harlan became a young man and entered politics when he was only in his early 20s. He quickly became a star in Kentucky and quickly became a force in Kentucky because he was charismatic, he was bright, he was attractive, he was known as somebody who could try to sort of thread that needle, where he could talk about the importance of the national interest. This is also something that goes back to his namesake, John Marshall. In that state of crisis, the Harlans believed that this whole concept of state rights and different states' rights was anathema to them, and that John Marshall, who believed in a strong federal constitution, that we all were citizens under the Constitution of the United States, that was what was going to help them transcend these sectional disputes. That became very real for Harlan when he was a politician in his 20s. He literally stood on the street corners of Louisville with a bullhorn in his mouth, imploring people in Kentucky not to join the Confederacy. The governor of Kentucky at that time was a Confederate sympathizer. The famous editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal, by far the most important newspaper in Kentucky, also had a wife from the South and two sons who joined the Confederate Army, and there was a fear that he would also support secession of Kentucky. Harlan and his father went to the owner of the newspaper, had the editor declared ill, and essentially wrote editorials themselves preserving Kentucky's neutrality. And then Kentucky, after a period of being neutral, became part of the Union. He had to become an activist himself. The Lincoln administration, which had no support in Kentucky at that time, coming into power, knew that it was crucial for them to to keep Kentucky in the Union, or at least to keep Kentucky neutral. So it sent guns to help loyalists sort of prevent this feared Confederate invasion. Harlan, his father, The Speed brothers, some of you who know the Lincoln story know Lincoln's closeness to James Speed and Joshua Speed, the two Speed brothers from Kentucky. They arranged to take the so-called Lincoln guns and distribute them to potential loyalists, not to forcibly overtake the Democratic government themselves, but in the event of a Confederate invasion. If you can imagine, for a young man with all these idealistic ideas in his head, a believer in the American system, watching this crisis unfold, but also being such a core participant, that had a huge effect. He also went on to fight in the Civil War. He pulled together a regiment of more than 1,000 men and led them into battle. He talked about at Shiloh stepping over dead bodies. He saw the terrible effect. Another thing that was a great factor in his life and a great part of his youth was his recognition, because of this sort of special prophecy his father had imposed on him, naming him after John Marshall, his interest in the Supreme Court. And he had a great belief in the Supreme Court right up to the point when the Supreme Court did something terrible, which was in the Dred Scott case, it went beyond just the facts of the fugitive slave law and whatever was necessary to settle the dispute over Dred Scott's freedom, and baldly declared that no Black people could ever have any rights under the Constitution, even free Black people. It took the view that the Constitution had been created by Europeans for Europeans, that only white people had rights under the Constitution. It was at that moment in the late 1850s that I think it dawned on John Harlan that all these compromises that he and his father had crafted and Henry Clay had crafted, all those compromises were not going to work, and the war was going to come because the Supreme Court had come up with a sweeping decision. And in the American system, there is no recourse if the Supreme Court gets it wrong. That was a lesson that I think he learned. There was a third aspect of his upbringing that I think had a tremendous effect on his later life, and that was the presence in his home of another Harlan, Robert Harlan. Robert Harlan was enslaved in the Harlan family home, but was treated more like a family member. This was a very strange thing because he had been born in Virginia in a county where James Harlan, John's father's mother, had relatives in Mecklenburg County, Virginia. But when Robert Harlan was 8 years old, he and his mother, who was an enslaved woman of mixed race, made a 450-mile journey out to Kentucky to find his father. We know this because Robert Harlan later became a famous man and a lot was written about him in newspapers and stuff. So this story was told repeatedly there. Where did he go to find his father but Harlan Station, which was essentially a family town in the middle of Kentucky, in the central part of Kentucky. And James Harlan, John's father, essentially adopted Robert as a son figure, but because he was Black, Robert could not be educated. James Harlan had 5 children with his wife, Eliza. Robert, who had been born when James was only 16 before he was married to Eliza, could not go to school in the way that the other 5 Harlan sons did. So he paradoxically was liberated to live this very different life because of his race. But it actually, and this is the paradoxical part, it actually helped him in some ways develop some skills that would hold him in good stead later in his life. So Robert Harlan developed this sixth sense for finding places and finding ways in which African Americans could succeed against the greatest of odds. And there are no greater odds than being enslaved, let's face it. But one of the things he found was that in the horse racing industry, which was just being created in Kentucky at that time, Black people were given an equal shot. That's because a lot of the horse owners were slave owners, and they would have their enslaved men serve as jockeys and trainers. People who remember that era in horse racing or have written about that era in horse racing describe the scene as being like a checkerboard, white and Black everywhere, because so many Black people were part of the pioneering move for horse racing. So think of John Harlan, who was 16 years younger than Robert, the little boy, watching Robert come home on a horse, having staged horse racing, with a leather pouch in his hand full of money from having run these races, with a gun because you had to enforce the betting rules by force if necessary. this sort of handsome, rakish figure, this sort of uncle figure in the family. And he was there as a family member, but as an African-American family member while John was young. That also would have a lot of effect later in his life. Let me tell you a little more about Robert Harlan, and you'll understand why Robert Harlan was such a significant figure. That horse racing experience that Robert had was just the start of an amazing life. In 1849, when the gold rush in California was announced, he was one of the first people to get on a boat, head down the Mississippi, go to Panama, bushwhack his way through the rainforest, get on another rickety boat, go all the way up these dangerous straits to the Pacific Ocean to San Francisco, and become an entrepreneur. He earned most of his money selling goods, which were dramatically inflated prices in San Francisco. Perhaps he also prospected, we don't know that, but we do know that he came back to Kentucky dragging a chest full of gold worth $4 or $5 million in today's dollars. But that doesn't even give you the sense of how much money it was back then, because so many basic costs were cheaper. So it was a vast amount of money. He then moved to Cincinnati, which at the time was the terminus of the Underground Railroad. This was in the 1850s, and invested in Black-owned businesses. And some of these businesses were really simple. Some of them were like, there was a supermarket that he invested in, a grocery. But he also invested in photography studios. He recognized that photography was another of those areas, because it was new technology, where Black people could get an equal shot. And in fact, the Black photographers of Cincinnati are part of the nation's pioneers in photography, and Robert Harlan funded them. He also held the mortgage on a place called the Dumas House. It was the leading African-American hotel in Cincinnati. So imagine people coming off of steamboats, coming from the South, the wealthy free Blacks in the front room, in this sort of red velvet environment, playing cards, playing poker. In the back room, which was like catacombed with these sort of small basement rooms, they hid fugitive slaves. Robert Harlan owned the mortgage on that property. During the Civil War and in the years leading up to the Civil War, he had this great idea that he was going to take American horses, his own horses that he bought, and go to Europe and stage a series of races, a transatlantic battle of the Titans, sort of, to try to prove that American horses were the equal of British mounts in the sport of kings. So he came to England and somewhat audaciously staged these races, and he wasn't entirely successful. He won a few, but not a lot, and nonetheless became a well-known figure in Europe. And we've reconstructed a lot of his life through like literally European newspaper accounts of Robert Harlan's life. Then after the Civil War, he returned to Ohio and became the leading African-American politician in Ohio. Now, this is very significant because after the war, the Civil War, John Harlan became the Attorney General of Kentucky and went through a dramatic period of political change. So when we last, talked about John Harlan, he was a colonel in the Union Army. In the last years of the war, he left in 1863 because of his father's tragic death. He had to take financial control of the family. But he also ended up winning an election to be the Attorney General of Kentucky. At first, he was very angry at the federal government because the Lincoln administration and then the Andrew Johnson administration put Kentucky under martial law. Here John Harlan had carried that bullhorn around Louisville, telling everybody to stay loyal to the Union government, making what he felt was a personal promise that he'd been assured by the Lincoln administration that if Kentucky remained neutral, it could choose its own course on many issues, including slavery. And in fact, it was not subject to the Emancipation Proclamation. But Harlan believed that autonomy had been violated by the federal government, that it was essentially treated like a defeated territory. Now, the other side of that from the federal government position was that there were certainly a lot of traitors to the Union cause sitting there in Kentucky, and there was probably good reason for it to be under martial law. And some of the people who imposed martial law then actually did rather heroic things to free slaves. So Harlan's position was a little questionable at that time. He then proceeded to try to continue to win elections as something of a moderate unionist figure, But Kentucky's politics went in a very different direction. The Ku Klux Klan was taking control after the Civil War. And very quickly, Harlan became appalled by the racial violence that was taking place in Kentucky, appalled by the mob rule. And he underwent a significant change and became a loyal Republican, adopted the Republican ideology. And at that time, during Reconstruction, the so-called radical Republican ideology was very punishing of the South and very supportive of African-American rights. And John Harlan became this way. He became friends with Frederick Douglass, another figure during that time who was so strongly in favor of Black rights and a great eloquent speaker. On the campaign trail in Kentucky, he would be challenged about, what about that friendship with Frederick Douglass? What are you doing dining with a Black person? He would respond, I'd rather dine with him any day of the week than a person who would seek to politicize these racial issues. So he very much changed his tune on race. And he continued to be a very respected lawyer. In 1876, we had what most of you know was a disputed presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. It became yet another crisis for the country. There were 3 southern states that had disputed elections and sent rival teams of electors to Washington. The election was sort of sorted out largely in smoke-filled rooms, back rooms, things like that. The Republicans controlled the government, so they were able to tip the presidency to Rutherford B. Hayes, but they wanted to have concessions made to the South. It's been a long matter of historical dispute whether there was any explicit promise to remove troops from the South. There was some thought that Hayes already believed that troops needed to be removed from the South, that you could not enforce federal control with a bayonet forever. But one of the concessions, one of the other backroom concessions that was offered to the South was to put a Southerner on the Supreme Court. Because during that period, the court was entirely Northern. And Hayes believed that as an olive branch to the South, as an olive branch, he would offer to make the first Southern appointments after the Civil War. So he takes the presidency, and then he faces this terrible problem. Here he's promised to put a Southerner on the court, but Congress is still controlled by radical Republicans, and the Judiciary Committee, especially by a senator from Vermont, who was very supportive of civil rights. So he had to find somebody who was credible enough to the South to fulfill his promise of appointing a Southerner, but also supportive enough of civil rights that he could make it through the Judiciary Committee. John Harlan was one of the few figures who popped up. Yet because Harlan had not been an abolitionist, he grew up in a slave-owning house. During that period at the end of the Civil War, he was angry at the federal government. He didn't initially support even ratification of the 13th Amendment. He thought Kentucky should chart its own course on slavery. He perhaps envisioned a plebiscite where people could vote on it, believing that that would be a more durable way of ending slavery rather than having it imposed by the federal government. All of this, however, made him a figure of deep suspicion to Northerners and Northern abolitionists. So during this period, who is a powerful person in Ohio but Robert Harlan? Ohio was the swing state in presidential elections. It was probably the most important state politically in the country. Robert Harlan, in controlling the African-American votes of Ohio, was a person of great power. He was on personal terms with so many of the great figures of that time, Ulysses S. Grant being one of them. And he personally vouched for John Harlan. He came to Washington and argued in favor of John Harlan getting the appointment. And here's this sense that John Harlan is not supportive enough of civil rights, yet here you have the leading Black leader of Ohio who grew up in the same home as John Harlan vouching for him. It was actually a tough confirmation, and John Harlan made it through. But we don't know how influential Robert Harlan's support was, but we know that it was perhaps significant. Nonetheless, when he joined the court, there was all this suspicion about him that the Northerners all had 14-karat gold credentials on race. That included the justices from Massachusetts, Stephen Fields, who had been appointed by Lincoln, born in Stockbridge, ardent abolitionist. Later, they were joined by Henry Billings Brown of Lee. He had also been an abolitionist. Melville Fuller eventually becomes the Chief Justice. He was from Maine, originally born in Maine, also had sterling credentials. Joseph Philo Bradley, born in Albany, made his fortune in Albany, also sterling credentials. And yet when it came to interpreting the very clear language of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, something changed in those men. What I think changed was their feelings about the times. There had been a tremendous economic boom in the North after the Civil War that was not present in the South and certainly not present in Kentucky. But it was driven by railroad investments, by the growth of corporations, by relationships between railroads and corporations that enabled a smaller numbers of manufacturers to control entire industries. Because if you had a deal with the railroads and exclusive control with the railroads, you could box out all the other manufacturers and set prices and wages, including in company towns out in the South and the West. So this drew tremendous capital to New York and New Jersey in particular, and great wealth to the North. And I think that those justices, all of whom came of age as corporate attorneys, as railroad attorneys, they were part of a generation of lawyers where the entire profession changed from being somebody who like hung a shingle on their door and helped neighbors resolve disputes to somebody who could be powerful enough to argue before the legislatures of New Jersey and New York, because at that time corporate issues were thought largely to be a state issue, but they could argue before the legislature on behalf of railroads and corporate combinations and win. And that victory meant so much and was so valuable that they became almost as wealthy as their clients, who were the people building these great mansions elsewhere. So if you're Henry Billings Brown, Joseph Philo Bradley, Melville Fuller, Stephen Field, and you're already in the late 1870s and 1880s, I think they came to believe that so much of this country's history had been marked by the fight over race and slavery, that the country's fabric had been torn apart by the Civil War, both a period before and after the Civil War. And they were asking themselves, how much longer is this going to go on? They were also, perhaps less flatteringly, saying, like, we need these Southern raw materials to keep this economic engine going up here in the North. And the Southerners just aren't going to accept Black equality. So they came up with a series of legal fictions, essentially, to ignore the true meaning and the original intent of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So if you're John Harlan, you served 6 years on the Supreme Court. Your first 6 years on the Supreme Court as kind of the court's junior member. He sort of played a kind of go along and get along sort of role. And then in 1883, he made a sharp, very sharp departure. It was the biggest case that was going to be on his entire tenure, 34-year tenure on the Supreme Court, the civil rights cases of 1883. As I mentioned before, Congress had passed a Civil Rights Act in 1875, but in both the North and South, there were many places where people would not honor it, where people simply would not serve a Black customer at a restaurant. They wouldn't allow a Black person on a train. They wouldn't have a Black man spend the night at an inn. So they collected all these cases with these really interesting plaintiffs, one of whom was a state representative in Missouri who was denied accommodations at the only inn in Jefferson City when he would go to do his duty before the legislature. But there were many of these national cases. And this case became a national requiem, a matter of urgent national importance. It was so important that they were interrupting theater productions in Georgia to give updates on this case. It was a real national requiem. And the Supreme Court wanted to be unanimous. They wanted to come down with a unanimous ruling. And they also wanted to do something that in their view would preserve the peace in the country. But Harlan's view of what would preserve the peace was dramatically different from that of his brethren. They believed that declaring that the 14th Amendment and the 13th Amendment were intended only to restrain state governments, and that therefore all these private acts of discrimination were beyond the control of the federal government and were state matters, which essentially meant that there would be no civil rights protection anywhere in the southern states for sure, and perhaps in a lot of the northern states as well. They wanted to coalesce around that theory. It wasn't a totally improbable decision. It wasn't the total abomination that the majority opinion of Plessy v. Ferguson and some of these other cases would be. But Harlan perceived it immediately as being deeply unfair. He thought it completely contravened the meaning of these post-war amendments that all these people had lived through. They knew what these amendments were intended to do, and they were intended to protect the rights of Black people precisely because it was believed that the South would not honor them. And here was the Supreme Court, by what Harlan called this ingenious construction, trying to negate the intentions of the framers of the Constitution, the clear intent of the Constitution, the plain language of the Constitution. And he wrote this long magisterial dissent that sort of balanced a sense of outrage. And I'll give you one example of the sense of outrage. Joseph Philo Bradley of Albany, the man who wrote the majority opinion in the civil rights cases of 1883, included a line that said, there must come a time in the life of any race that it ceases to be the special favorite of the law and takes the rank of mere citizen. Harlan shot back in his dissent, I scarcely think it's fair to say that Black people have been the special favorites of the law. I mean, he was calling out the Supreme Court on the most basic of deliberate sort of dissembling that was going on in the majority opinion. He also, in a different way in this opinion, articulated a different vision of what 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment jurisprudence should be. One thing he pointed out was that in common law, both in Britain and the United States, there was a sense that if you were part of transportation or providing innkeeper services were the only inn in a town, you essentially were serving a state function and you were obliged to serve everybody. That later became known as the sort of stream of commerce theory that prevailed in American law much later. He also entertained the idea that under the Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce, it could simply order railroads, for example, to serve Black people. He pointed out that the federal government was underwriting loans to railroad companies to help promote expansion, westward expansion. And nobody had any problem with that, federal intervention. So why couldn't they require the same railroads to serve Black people? All of these doctrines will appear later, decades later in American law, and many of them are part of the law today. But in 1883, it was a matter of first impression for John Harlan. After that fundamental break, there was a tremendous amount of attention to his position, largely in the Black community. Frederick Douglass wrote to him, called it the greatest opinion in the history of the Supreme Court, said it should be spread like autumn leaves over all of America. He called Harlan a moral hero. But the white community, satisfied with this result, basically paid no attention. That set off a series of race cases in which Harlan steadfastly dissented when voting rights were considered. And the 15th Amendment is essentially exclusively about voting rights. When Alabama passed a constitution that grandfathered in all the descendants of Confederate veterans, but allowed local election officials to turn people away from the polls on not just poll taxes and literacy tests, but just belief in the bad character of a man. Black people got together, 5,000 plaintiffs who had voted in the past, who had no criminal histories, who had paid all their taxes, payroll taxes, poll taxes included, and yet still were denied to vote because an election worker said they had bad character in places where Blacks weren't allowed to vote at all. They came to the Supreme Court for relief. Justice Holmes wrote an opinion saying that Alabama clearly intended to disenfranchise Black people. but there was no enforcement mechanism for the Supreme Court. They said, what can we do? They want to have us force them to be registered to vote, but the whole scheme is fraudulent. What does it mean to add another 5,000 names to an essentially fraudulent scheme? The only solution here is in the political system, which everybody knew was no solution at all. I mean, he was essentially saying that Alabama itself had to deal with this problem, which it would not. And John Harlan dissented and said, these people are entitled to their voter registration. In Plessy v. Ferguson, seminal case, Louisiana passes a law saying Black people and white people must be in separate cars on railroads. The law gets challenged. I think all of you know the facts of this case. But this was 13 years after the civil rights cases of 1883. Harlan had been through these race cases before. He had felt a sense of frustration. Unlike his big, long dissenting opinion in 1883, he did a much shorter opinion, but one that was pithier. And it reached deep into sort of the foundational principles of American law. And those of you who are lawyers or have studied law know how rare that is to do that, to actually make reference to these foundational principles. You know, most cases are settled on technicalities. And he wrote, the Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. There is no caste here. These are great lines that should be etched on the walls of courthouses. And he called out forcefully the majority. Henry Billings Brown of Lee, Massachusetts, he wrote the majority opinion and he said, separate but equal, nothing wrong here. If anyone sees a stigma in being in the Blacks only coach, it's because Black people themselves put that stigma on them. Harlan penetrated that again with that same sort of common sense view that he had in the civil rights cases of 1883 and said, nobody would be so wanting as to in candor as to believe that the intention of this law was anything but to segregate Black people. It was not to separate the races. It was to stigmatize and segregate Black people. He also, in all of these dissents, predicted, and he did in the Plessy dissent, he said, what could more surely sow the seeds of race hate in this country than an enactment that proceeds upon the grounds that Black people are so inferior they should not even be allowed in the same railroad cars as white people. He was essentially predicting the pernicious effects of the next 100 years. What we found when we, being me and my researchers, went and looked at African-American newspapers, which had recently been digitized just in the last 10 or 15 years, because we found that while these dissents got almost no attention, the whole Plessy v. Ferguson case got no attention in the mainstream media, they were widely discussed in the Black community. When John Harlan died in 1911, there were spontaneous memorial services in cities across the country, including Boston, where he had never visited, but Black people and Black churches came together to mourn him as the sole defender of Black rights. In Washington, there were 3 of those services, culminating in a fourth, which was a joint memorial service at Metropolitan AME, which then and now still the largest Black church in Washington. And there, 1,000 people, all of them African Americans, came together, and Harlan's dissents were read aloud. And you put yourself in a position of a young person there at that service, hearing those words. The Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. And it was inspiring. And even people who were too young to attend that service and weren't born yet, like Thurgood Marshall was born right around that time, 2 years later, he came across Harlan's dissents and was inspired. When in the 1930s and 40s, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was trying to persuade plaintiffs in the South to challenge the system of segregation, they had Harlan's dissent as the basis of their legal arguments, but also as sort of a moral reminder to these Black people who were going to take the risk of becoming plaintiffs, knowing that the Ku Klux Klan was there in force, taking names and threatening people, that there was hope that at least one white person in a position of power could see the world through their eyes and could see what wrong had been done to them. Harlan called the Plessy dissent Thurgood Marshall called the Plessy dissent by Harlan to be his Bible. They included lines from Harlan's dissent in all of their briefs challenging segregation, including the one in Brown versus Board of Education. Now, Harlan also, as we know, became a leading dissenter in economic cases. I referred to the dissent in the Sherman Antitrust Act being declared unconstitutional, the income tax being declared unconstitutional, Lochner v. New York, another famous case saying that labor laws were unconstitutional. Over time, all of those precedents were overturned, and Harlan's dissents played a role in those cases too. So his prescience and the roots of his difference weren't exclusively on the race side. But I still think that if people think of John Marshall Harlan today, they have to think of him as the man who, at the very worst time in American law, when these terrible decisions that are abominations, I set out in this book thinking that there would be some really interesting backs and forths in these cases, that it would be interesting dramas. Actually, the majority opinions are so wrong-headed that nobody today would endorse those opinions. Harlan, in that dark hour when the court was resorting to these legal fictions to try to impose its own will on the country, he stood up for the Constitution. He also stood up for the foundational principles of democracy. He stood up for the idea of equality under the law. That's why I think he stands alone as a great figure in American history, in American legal history, and has been neglected over all these years. So that's my story of John Harlan. I see that some of you have put questions here in the chat room. I'm happy to go through them myself, unless Katie wants to choose a few. I don't know if you've been going through. Do you want me to just read them in the chat room and sort of go through them and see?
Sure. There was some, a fellow Peter was making some great comments about your book and was really intrigued by how much of the book is devoted to Robert and his engagement in politics, and what an important theme that was in the book, and was hoping that you could speak even more about Robert.
Robert Harlan's story is amazing in its own right. And Robert Harlan's story also plays another role in this book, which is, first of all, I think Robert Harlan did play a role in getting John Harlan on the Supreme Court. They also collaborated in an important crisis in Harlan's life, John Harlan's life, where a cousin on his mother's side of the family, who was a raging alcoholic, shot a leading Black figure in Washington in a dispute over, believe it or not, a stove that had been sold to somebody. But at the time, the federal government controlled the legal system of Washington. And the lawyer for the cousin asked John's help in defending the cousin and keeping him from the gallows. And at least the rumor that went out was that John Harlan offered that help. And it seems very likely that he did, because he always believed, you were responsible for your kin. This was sort of the idea that you stand up for your kin. Nonetheless, this was before he was on the Supreme Court. There was real rage within the Black community about John Harlan's involvement in this case, because the man who had been shot was the brother-in-law of John Mercer Langston, who later was the founder of Howard University Law School and a really leading figure in the Black community. Robert perceived that because this was a time when Black people had actual power in the Republican Party, that if this rumor and controversy took root, it would prevent John Harlan, from making it onto the Supreme Court. So Robert went to Washington and negotiated a compromise whereby the Harlan family agreed that the drunken cousin would be kept out of Washington forever and ever if he were to plead guilty, but to be released under or pardoned because he was insane with alcoholism at the time of the shooting. And Robert brokered that deal and reported back to John and sort of spared John's career. So I think Robert did play a large role in John's career. But the other purpose in the book that the Robert Harlan side of the story shows is it shows how even the leaders of the Black community were affected by segregation. And in the case of Robert's family, more affected by segregation than they were by slavery, amazingly. Robert himself was a successful, wealthy man. He delivered a famous speech in the 1870s where he, even though he boasted of having only a half-day schooling himself, he said, the to the Black community, let education be our byword. And in one generation, this despised race that had been enslaved could take a position of true equality um, versus white people. It's very poignant to read it now because it shows just what a believer in the American system Robert Harlan was. And he raised his own son, who went to college and law school and became this sort of aristocratic figure. You know, he would sing in Gilbert and Sullivan operas and things like that, and became a civil servant, but also the owner of businesses in Washington. But he had his pay slashed by 20% by Woodrow Wilson in Wilson's assault on Black businesses. Black office holders in the federal government. And he would have been fired if he didn't have civil service protection at the time. The businesses that Robert Harlan Jr. had failed because in segregation, there were no white customers. If you're running a department store in a Black neighborhood at the time, white people would never come and shop there. The grandson of Robert Harlan, another person who was educated to be sort of an elite kind of figure, ended up driving a cab after all his businesses failed. So the irony is that the descendants of Robert Harlan had fewer opportunities than Robert Harlan himself had. Which shows that when people say, well, slavery ended and, Black people got half a loaf and at least they got that, nobody was saying they should go back to slavery. But Robert Harlan actually found more opportunities as a freed Black man or a man treated as being free initially under slavery than his descendants did under segregation. So I noticed there are a couple more questions here. Can I say a bit more about the relationship between originalism and creating legal fictions under the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment? One of the things, Jennifer, that's really prominent about this book is that Harlan's admired equally by liberals and conservatives. Liberals really see him as a man who cared deeply about the effects on the ground of his decisions. And he made reference to how the law affects average people. He also talked about the effect of these Supreme Court decisions on the future, which is, of course, the legacy of Dred Scott and his own feelings about how Dred Scott destroyed the country. So liberals admire Harlan deeply for that. Conservatives believe that when he was dissenting in these race cases, that he was standing up for the original intent and the plain language of the Constitution. The Constitution literally guarantees equal protection under the law. People will say, well, what does that mean? If not, you have to have your, true equal rights. Harlan believed that it did. So conservatives have adopted Harlan or see Harlan as a figure of admiration there too. Now, some conservatives will say, well, see, Harlan's views, if Harlan were around, he would be against affirmative action. Liberals would say, no, he wouldn't be. Thurgood Marshall himself said Harlan would be supportive of affirmative action because he would be the first to recognize that after Plessy v. Ferguson, Black people were denied equal rights. If they hadn't, if they had listened to Harlan back in 1896, there'd be no need for affirmative action. So anyway, that's part of the relationship between originalism and textualism. But I think that people today who view originalism and textualism as some sort of a legal fiction that the right wing uses to try to enforce conservative principles, I don't think that's true. I think that, believing in the text of the Constitutional and the original intent of the Constitution are significant tools for interpreting the Constitution. They're not the final word on the subject, but they're not some evil made up ideology either. Another question. Your book suggests that Robert is a child of James. What evidence did you come up with that he was the half brother of John? Well, clearly they believed they were half brothers, even though it was never explicitly stated. Robert was a famous man in politics, and there were many, many newspaper accounts in his time that said he was the son of James Harlan, and he didn't correct that record. There were others that sort of were blurred the lines and just said he came to Harlan Station to find his father. There was a report in the Louisville Courier-Journal that in a profile of Robert described him as looking amazingly like the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall Harlan, just a little bit darker in the skin. So people clearly believed that they were brothers at that time. There was a DNA test 5 generations later, just about 20 years ago, that discouraged the notion of a blood relation, said it was unlikely. Keep in mind, that's not the same thing as finding like DNA at the crime scene. This is 5 generations later where there could have been breaks in the family line and stuff, and it still is not reported. So it's an open question whether they were related. I think the question is still open. The DNA test suggests they were not, but they totally believed they were. So it's an interesting question. How did John become a member of the Know Nothing Party that was anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic? He did because the Whig Party collapsed and the American Party, which is the Know Nothings, essentially kind of replaced the Whig Party in Kentucky. He was not virulently anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic, although his father at one point was accused of helping to promote an anti-immigrant kind of ideology. I think there was a strain in Harlan's thinking that the United States was this great experiment in democracy. Everybody else in the world was ruled by monarchs and monarchies. I think it did occur to him, or very early in his life, we're talking when he's in early 20s, that papal infallibility might make Catholics unwilling to take their place as democratic citizens, that they would follow edicts of the Pope. But he changed his views actually at a fairly young age and wrote about the role of two Catholic priests in his regiment in Civil War and how they convinced him that Catholics could be very loyal Americans. He also later in life totally repudiated the Know Nothing Party, said it was the worst moment of his life, that he was forced to do it by his father. And you never heard him anywhere else blame his father for anything. He was an admirer of his father's, but the fact that he would later in life throw his father under the bus suggests just how strongly he wanted to erase any notion that he ever shared the Know Nothing ideology. Then you say, can you talk about why it took so long for another case to reach the Supreme Court to challenge the segregation ruling? As we're seeing now with abortion, the Supreme Court gets to choose which cases it takes. I think that for a long time, African Americans gave up on the Supreme Court. Even at the time of Plessy v. Ferguson, the dominant leaders of the Black community, including Robert Harlan, were skeptical of challenging the Separate Car Act in Louisiana because they felt the Supreme Court was so reactionary that it would just yield a terrible opinion. And they were right. The people who challenged the Separate Car Act in New Orleans were Creoles who were only a small part non-white, but who were cast as being Black. And I think, today they're talking about, formal apologies to Homer Plessy and all that, which is legally correct and justified. But Homer Plessy was 1/8 Black. And essentially the case was built around the idea that here are these people who look 100% white, that no one would even know that they had any Black ancestry. And yet the law arbitrarily assigns them as Black, and that's wrong. And the case even raised an issue of property rights, that, your racial identity is an important property right, trying to win over the, laissez-faire economics folks on the Supreme Court to this idea that you're limiting people's economic opportunities by labeling them Black. So the plaintiff and the people bringing the cases, the committee behind the plaintiff in Plessy v. Ferguson, there's nothing disreputable about them. They were defending their rights, but the point that they were defending is that wealthy Creoles in New Orleans should not be considered Black. They weren't necessarily, vindicating the rights of all African Americans. So I think that the Black leaders lost faith in the courts, and it wasn't until the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, under first Charles Houston and then Thurgood Marshall, started picking away at the separate but equal doctrine that these cases were.
There was another question about local ties. Was David Dudley Field of Stockbridge a character in the story? He was very important.
Oh, he's the brother. David Dudley Field. There are two David Dudley Fields, one senior and one junior. I assume you're talking about junior if they're talking about modernizing the civil practice in New York. I think that senior may have been a minister, but the first David Dudley Field was the elder brother of Stephen Field, Justice Stephen Field, who was on the Supreme Court for more than 30 years. And David Dudley Field was probably a decade older than Stephen Field. And Stephen Field had been a clerk in his brother's law office. And David Dudley Field was indeed considered a great legal pioneer. And Stephen Field was sort of considered the lesser Field brother, who was so much in his brother's shadow in Stockbridge and in the Northeast that he moved to California to make his fortune. And he did in the law and in politics, and became the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court in California, but was also known for carrying a gun around. It was such a Wild West atmosphere in California that in later years, Stephen Field sort of romanticized his time in California as showing what a rugged individual, what a true American he became in California. and somewhat distanced himself from his Stockbridge upbringing. But his brother, David Dudley Field, was a huge part of his life on Justice Stevens.
That's all I see in the chat, unless anyone else wants to chime in before we wrap things up.
If you're moved to buy the book, do go to the bookstore in Lenox, as Katie suggested. It's a great way to support a local institution. Some of you know Matthew Tannenbaum, I'm sure. He's a great supporter of the book. And as Katie mentioned, I'd be happy to. I have signed some books for Matt, but I'd be happy to personalize them if you either reach out to me through Katie, but also if you just wanted to leave the book with Matt with an instruction on who to make it out to, I'd be happy to do that, to personalize it. I'm here in Great Barrington at least for another couple of weeks, so I'll stop by the bookstore and be in a position to sign books too.
It really is a wonderful book, Peter, and the parallel lives of Robert and John, as you described them, teach so much about the history of race in the United States at that time.
It does, absolutely, and it also confounds some of our understandings of the history of race, because there was real respect between them. At least all the evidence suggests that. So.
Well, thank you, Peter. This was just a wonderful talk. I can see so many lovely comments coming in. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And please support local, support Peter. Go buy a copy of that book, or you can borrow one from the library. We have a copy here, and there are many in the system. So thank you again, and I wish you all a very happy holiday season. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Good night.
Oh, there's Wendy Strothman. She appeared for a minute.
Yeah.